For
This
the
conference will now be recorded.
There we go. Thank you all so much for the invitation to be with you. I would much rather be with you in person, and I much prefer to do presentations where you can raise your hand and interrupt and jump in and ask a question at any point. So yeah, that's one of the harder parts for me, of course, as well as just being able to be together physically. And I'm so grateful for the technology that allows us to stay connected in these chaotic times. And I think there have been these little gifts in this chaotic time, and sometimes I have to step back and remember those, the gifts of not driving as much. I really appreciate that as a mom who's used to running around driving kids, and also the busyness, really appreciating less busyness, and appreciating the ways that we are able to creatively stay connected and be in touch with one another. So thanks. So I was invited to come and talk to you about racism in this moment. And I think that there's so much chaos right now, of course. Our political climate, as I was saying a minute ago, feels like it couldn't be hotter. You know, I just realized I should probably introduce myself for the people who don't know me as well.
Amanda, I was actually supposed to introduce you, and so you just kind of started talking, and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to let Amanda just go. But can I introduce you?
Okay, sure. Sorry about that, everybody. We just jumped right in.
No, that's fine. But we're so happy to have you, Amanda. Amanda Henderson, many of you do know her. You are the executive director of the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado since 2014. You're also an ordained minister in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ tradition. And many of our people on this call have heard you preach, and in fact have had the benefit of having you be our interim pastor for, I think, a summer, right? Several years ago. And you are an active pastor, continue to preach and teach in multiple communities. You're also a graduate of Bright Divinity School in Texas Christian University, and an alumnus of the Beatitudes. Whoops, I feel like my phone is recording me too. Alumnus of the Beatitudes Society and a frequent speaker and writer on the topics of interfaith understanding, advocacy, and civic engagement. You're also a well-known community leader here in Denver. You'll see Amanda on TV and on the radio quite a bit, talking about her work, and she's a well-known leader for bringing people together for healing in times of tragedy and mobilizing individuals and groups in times of injustice. I would also like to say that she is, oh my gosh, I don't even have my book. Oh, yes, I do. She's also the author of Holy Chaos, which just came out this spring, or this actually summer, a fantastic book that's gotten rave reviews, and you all should go out and buy one from chalicepress.com or wherever you buy books. So I would like to turn it over to Reverend Henderson. Thank you so much for being with us, Amanda.
Thank you so much. All right. And just a reminder, if anybody, their phone is not, or their computer is not muted, if you want to mute it, that is super helpful to stop any feedback noise. So as I was starting to say, I was asked to come and talk about racism and to talk about how we talk about racism. And I think that right now, of course, there are a few things happening. We have had, once again, a rise in consciousness of the real violence that continues to happen to people of color at the hands of police, and the real differences in the ways that racism is so embedded into every facet of our lives. And so sorry, there's still a little bit of feedback. Is it Melba? I don't know if I can. Are you able to mute your computer?
Sure. I thought.
Okay, great. All right, I think that's helping. Perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry. So we feel this imperative again. Now, I want to say that First Plymouth has been one of the communities that has been a part of this work for a long time. This isn't new to First Plymouth. You all have been leaders in the congregations that are doing work, real anti-racism work, to both do that internal work as well as the community voice and working for transformation for racial equity. So this isn't new to you. And I know that so many of us in this time of a presidential election that feels beyond divisive, not just feels, but we're seeing the results of it on the street. There was a shooting yesterday in Denver, I'm sure many know, and what we're seeing in many towns, there are deep concerns around the future of our country and the ways that we can navigate these divisions that feel just heartbreaking. So we're going to focus in on racism as part of the root of those divisions and how we can talk about it with those, especially, or I guess we'll talk different, like who we're talking to as one of those questions. So the first thing I want to name is that when we're talking about racism, I feel like there are three areas that we can zoom in on. One is the internal work. That's the work that so many of you have been doing in your book studies and your groups and reflecting. This is the work of watching movies that challenge your assumptions, to watch the 13th, to read the new Jim Crow, to read Ta-Nehisi Coates, to, this is the internal work, as well as reflecting yourself on how do I feel when I hear this? Where do I feel resistant? Where do I feel defensive? Where do I feel sad and heartbroken and guilty and shameful for the ways that I have been so deeply embedded in this and didn't even know it for so long? So those are all, that is the internal work that is a vital piece of doing work for racial justice. It's also really important to do that work before we speak. And I don't mean to say that there's like some timeline. I actually see these as a circle or a spiral. We are always doing the internal work, and there are times that we're continually becoming more aware and more alert to both our own feelings and experiences, as well as to the systemic racism around us. So that's a continual process. And it's a vital process before we open our mouth, I think. And so many of us, maybe when we first got started doing this work, we immediately went to talking, but we hadn't actually done the work. And so it's really important to do that work and then to listen. And so the second category that I think about is the relational work. And this is where we're going to spend most of our time today. And so I'm going to pause that. And then the other area is the acts of transformation. So there's the internal work, there's the relational work, and then there's the acts of transformation. And this is the, working for policy change. This is the addressing economic disparities. This is going and speaking at the city council or working with the school board to make sure that there is real equity for students of color, or the legislative work around criminal justice reform. This is the acts of transformation. So I see all three of these things on a spiral that would be talking about and living into racial equity work and anti-racism: internal work, relational work, and acts of transformation. So a few things of the internal work as we move into the relational work. I named that these three pieces of noticing, just starting to watch. I think that when a lot of people first start understanding racism and the ways that we have been so deeply embedded, I mean, I think of it as it's the air we breathe and the water we swim in, and we can't escape it, and we didn't even know we were breathing it. And then as soon as we start to have our eyes open to it, we start to realize, personally, my parents moved to Colorado Springs from Las Vegas, Nevada when I was 12 years old. And they moved to Colorado Springs because there were good schools. And they moved to Colorado Springs and North Colorado Springs, particularly to District 20, because it was the best school district. And they wanted me to have opportunities, and it was safe. And there were 5 students of color in my entire high school. I'm guessing I'm not alone in that. And there's a great podcast called Nice White Parents. If you haven't heard of it, check it out. It's by the New York Times, Nice White Parents. And so these things I just named, good schools, good neighborhood, these are things that have become our racial dividers. And I remember in school knowing like the schools that were ghetto or in the bad part of town, or all of the different ways that I was taught that those schools were less than my school. And those schools had majority students of color. So as we start to reflect and notice, we become aware of these threads throughout our entire life and the decisions that we made. My husband and I moved to Littleton. We joke that we didn't move back to Fort Collins because it was so white, and so then we moved to Littleton. Probably not our best move. But at the time, we had all of these different factors. We wanted our kids to be in good schools. We wanted a nice neighborhood where our kids could have their own bedrooms, but we could also afford it, and it was close to the mountains. And guess how many people of color live in Littleton? Not many. And guess the history, too, Berkeley says, the history of Littleton is riddled with redlining. And there is, documentation of the ways that there were movements that were attempted to bring increase racial diversity at Lockheed Martin, one of the main employers where people moved to Littleton, and they got such incredible pushback that all of the people of color that they had moved here, one, couldn't find a place to live, and then felt so rejected and so, treated with hate and racism that they didn't stay. And so those patterns are there. We all know this, and when we stop to take time to reflect and notice it, there's all sorts of feelings, right? So this is the internal work. Learning, noticing, reflecting. The next piece of that internal work, and this is going to move us into the relational conversations, is developing the practices to be able to step into relationships and navigate racism, talk about racism, come to terms with racism, and take what other people are feeling and experiencing while also being able to hold your own stuff. So these 3, I'm doing everything in 3s today, so it's like a good sermon. So the 3 things I'm going to name are curiosity. And I talk about curiosity a lot in the book Holy Chaos, if you've read it. And honestly, I'm on a whole curiosity thing. I feel like we need to really be embracing curiosity more. Listening and courage. So as we step into relationships or begin to navigate conversations about racism, a posture of curiosity, and Parker Palmer talks about when the going gets rough, turn to wonder, and holding curiosity when I'm starting to judge someone, when I'm automatically, our brains are automatically always judging, categorizing, putting things into what we know. But when we open ourselves up to curiosity, we actually shift the way our brain is processing. And we create more openings and more space to be able to receive without those walls of judgment that shut things down and put things into quick categories. So either when, and the next piece I'm going to talk about like who the relationship is with, but whether you are engaging in a conversation with a person of color or with white folks, or white folks who are like-minded, or white folks who have a different experience or perspective on racism than you do. All three of those, curiosity is a posture that will help you move into the space of dialogue and conversation with openness and being able to really take in another person's experience and view. The other is the next one is listening. And how many times have we been hearing this? And we all know this one. We've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we all need to listen more. And even when we are talking with people who very much disagree with us on racism, having a posture of curiosity and listening and maybe asking some questions, tell me more about your experience with that. We can be able to let people express some of those feelings of their own internal work around racism. And through listening, rather than quickly telling people how to think or see or all the facts, amazing facts that you read in the new Jim Crow, because I want to do that, that listening to someone and walking with them as they work through their own internal processes is a gift and a part of racial equity work, anti-racism work. The third one I named is courage, because you inevitably will mess up. You inevitably will say something stupid. I've done it so many times. I've got lots of examples of it in the book. Berkeley's never done that, but everybody else, yes. We will all say something and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that. That was so hurtful. Or get called on something. If you have someone who's really a wonderful person in your life and can say, hey, when you just said that, I heard it like this. Or you might want to be careful when talking about that like that. And then I'll step back and go, oh my gosh, I did not mean to be hurtful. I realize I was, and I'm going to think about this and do better next time. And so, and even like, no matter what the situation is, we will mess up. And so we will also feel fear and discomfort. It is scary to step into, especially if there's someone that you love, that you're in a relationship with, that you care about, a family member, all of those feelings of fear that, this could damage this relationship if I share with them that I support the Black Lives Matter movement and they think the Black Lives Matter movement is a terrorist organization. And so as I step into this conversation, it could damage our relationship long-term. There's fear. Also, what if I don't say things the right way and I make it worse? All of those things. To move into these spaces takes courage. And to mess up, try and make it right, and step back in takes double courage. We just have to keep on working through those processes and be willing to mess up, learn, and try again. I'm gonna take a drink of water. So that was a continual of the internal work. Now I want to move us to the relational work of talking about racism. Now, in the little blurb for this, I mentioned that so many of us move to that fear response when we are engaging in work, talking about an issue that is divisive, or could be construed as political, which this is a rant of mine. Racism is not a political issue. It's a human issue. So, don't get me started. But as we're stepping into these spaces, some of us fight. We're, as I mentioned, we're the first person on Facebook to push back, to speak, to jump. We're a fighter. Others of us are a flighter. I don't want anything to do with it. I'm out. Or like unfriend on social media, or I'm going to avoid this person like the plague because I know something racist is going to come out of their mouth and I don't know how to deal with it. So I'm just going to avoid them. Or freeze. And how many times have we been in a situation where something happens or someone says something and we just freeze and totally shut down? And there's, each of us do each of these, and I think some of us are more predisposition to one or the other. With my 3 kids, I actually have a fighter, a flighter, and a freezer. And it's funny, I'll take the fighter any day. She's a lot easier to like push with. I just gave away that it's not the boy. So, knowing ourselves and how we respond in these situations is helpful going in, and to try and push ourselves. If we're a fighter, push yourself into the listening posture and the curiosity posture. If you're a flighter, push yourself into the courage posture and push yourself to step into that space and practice that. And if you're a freezer, similar, both practice really listening, because I think sometimes when we freeze, we don't even listen anymore. We just shut down. So if you're a freezer, really listen and then move to the courage to speak. So if we were all in a room, I would have you raise your hands and say who's a fight, flight, or freezer. So now let's move to the relational piece. So first, let's talk about talking racism with people of color. How many people feel a little self-conscious? I can't see you all, but when you are going to talk to someone who is a person of color, who's experienced deep racism, how do you feel when you go into those conversations? A little nervous, like I'm definitely going to say the wrong thing. I don't want to, and then like, how am I going to appear when I say the wrong thing? And all of those things are normal questions. So the first piece is, again, listening. Listening is always the first best posture when you are talking to a person of color about racism. Really, you should be listening to a person of color about racism. So doing any like, oh, I'm learning about racism and I just learned it, like that would be like white-splaining to a person of color about racism. That's not very helpful. And so moving to a posture of listening is the first place. The next is just a reminder of the multiplicity of views and experiences of people of color. So making assumptions about their experience of racism is also dangerous territory. Each person of color has a different experience of being a person of color, just like each white person has a different experience of being white. There are some themes, obviously, but making assumptions can be counterproductive to the work of racial, anti-racism, racial equity work. So really understanding the multiplicity of people, the experiences that people have had who are people of color. The next is really trying to build relationships of mutuality. I think oftentimes for white folks who are in relationships with people of color, we have taken on this like kind of a condescending or like that white supremacist view, like, oh, I have all the answers, or I have all the resources, or, you know, it's this deeply embedded superiority. I mean, this is like something to just constantly come to terms with, is how do I have an actual mutual relationship as I'm building a relationship with someone who's a person of color? And I think that checking yourself on that, and checking your assumptions about where that person's at is one piece. Another is sharing, like being more open with your life and what you care about, and asking them about their life and what they care about. And I think that one of the easiest ways to build real connections is finding those points of, you know, our families, our work, the sports teams, the things that we're excited about, hobbies, that finding something else that you are really curious about that person, and having a general interest in, you know, tell me about your kids. Oh, you ran a marathon? That's so exciting. Tell me about that. You're finding those points of connection and tapping into curiosity and letting go of assumptions or judgments about their life or experience as a person of color. So I'm not going to spend as much time talking about that, but I'm happy to talk about that more, because I think I have had several people say to me, I don't know how to build relationships with people of color. And there's this longing, I think, especially for white folks who have been grown up and placed ourselves in these white bubbles, that we haven't had the real experience, especially in Colorado, of having genuine, authentic, mutual relationships with people of color. And so moving beyond the Black friend trope to actually being in a caring friendship with someone who has a very different life experience, or really similar but different skin color, you know, but a different experience in your same circle. You know, I could have a neighbor who's a person of color and they would have a very different experience in Littleton than I do. So those are just a few. The other two quick tips is an acknowledgement of pain when there is, especially during this time of police violence and these videos that are played over and over, acknowledging the trauma that is felt. And I know with my friends who are people of color, one of the first things that I'll do is just send them some love. Just, I love you, I'm thinking of you. And you don't even have to go into the trauma of the police video or the latest shooting, but acknowledging how painful this is to be reliving constantly the trauma of, and you know, even yesterday, this police shooting in Denver, and how it's gotten wrapped up in Black Lives Matter movement, and the co-opting that's happening of groups that are actually white-led of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then acting with violence. You know, this is bringing up this similar like co-opting of movements for Black lives by white groups, and acting in ways that are hurtful. Just acknowledging, giving extra love, giving extra support, giving extra grace, also acknowledging that we're all growing in this time, and that, you know, the experiences for white folks of who are coming to terms and understanding racism in new ways, there's a lot of Black folks who are also like, you know, this is Trump as well.
I think it is.
Great. So the other, we're all learning. Technology also, we're all learning. So I'm going to spend the rest of our time before we go into Q&A talking racism with white folks. And again, in this, I'm going to break it into two categories. One is talking racism with white folks who are like-minded, or we assume are like-minded, who are working to address racism, who are, you know, engaged with you in this work. So a few things in this when talking with those of us who we think we're all with us. One is noticing patterns that can be replicating white supremacist mindsets, where we can become condescending, we can become a little self-righteous, and we can cause harm in the ways that we are talking about and doing the work, or talking about those racists in ways that are also not aligned with how we want to live in healthy relationships. And how do we truly embody the values that are so core to who we hope to be, grounded in relationships that are mutual and generative and connected, and treating every single person with compassion and dignity and respect and kindness. So how do we do that when we are good white folks talking about racism, learning about racism? I feel like we have to make sure that we're not being condescending, that we're not making assumptions, that we're holding curiosity and listening, aiming for mutuality as we start to step into these relationships. So similar to how we don't want to make assumptions or assume homogeneity among folks who are people of color, we also don't want to make assumptions or assume homogeneity of folks who we might deem as blind to racism or overtly say racist things or act in ways that we feel are racist. Now, I'm not, of course, talking about like the militant groups who are, you know, going to Portland, and I'm talking about the people in our circles who might not be aware yet of the ways that racism impacts their lives and shapes their lives. So, you know, this is kind of one circle out. The far right extremists who are, you know, neo-Nazis, that's a different category. I don't imagine we're going to be in many of those conversations. And so I'm going to bracket that and talk about those people who are in our circles who haven't yet realized, haven't done their own work, and how do we engage in these conversations? So as we are, or first I actually want to name, sorry, this is when I should have slides because then I would remember to stop jumping around. In those spaces of like-minded white folks doing anti-racism work, I think that one of the things that we can do is to model authentic relationships. I mean, this is just something that we all need to do, right? Is to continually work to build relationships with one another that are modeling the relationships that we want to be creating our world, our communities. So live with each other, like be the change you want to be in the world. There you go, there's the, but be that in those relationships with one another as you're doing the anti-racism work. So the next piece is working with people who are in that second circle of oppositional, who aren't aware of racism, who haven't done the work, who might say that all lives matter, who might think that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist group because they see, you know, what's been done on they see the news, they're watching a different news channel than you, they have a very different story that's been told to them. So I'm creating a little, one of the tips that we learn is using a message triangle. And so if you have paper and pen, you can even draw a little triangle. And when you step into these kinds of spaces and conversations, on one point of the triangle is my values. Hey, good job, Deb. I need whiteboard on WebEx. Do they have that? That's what we need. So at the top of the triangle is my values. So this is something that's great to take some time to think about. What's a quick way to say what you value most in the relation? I just jumped ahead in my brain. What do you value most? I value most relationships. So when you're talking to or before you talk to someone, let's write out these 3 triangles. What do you value most? Relationship for me. The second could be statistics. So did you know that our criminal justice system, that Black men make up, and I'm going to botch the statistic, but 30% of the population in the prison system, but only 8% of the US population. And then the third piece of the triangle is my story. My experience is that, and so if you have those 3 pieces, my values, and then some facts, and then your story. And the reason why these 3 points are the important pieces of the conversation is that we know that facts don't move people, that values and story move people. And at the same time, I want to push back on something that says that facts don't matter, because facts matter, but we know they don't move people. But if we can put them in a triangle with values and story, then we can slide the facts in so that people might hear them in a different way or feel them in a different way. So we might be able to say, I believe that all people should have the freedom to be able to live the life that they want to live, and to be able to move in the world just like I do and you do. This is so important to me. And the fact is that Black men are pulled over by police at a rate of 6 to 1. I'm just making up that fact. And my friend, Travis, who is a Black man, has told me his story about being pulled over 17 times this year. So I'm just making that up. So if you, then it evokes to people, and then you listen to their story. But if you can learn how to speak out of your values, facts, and story, then this is a way to be able to engage in a conversation that also, if you've done a little bit of this work in advance, then it comes to you a little bit more easily, and you're able to avoid that fight, flight, freeze reflex, because you have trained yourself to know, okay, this is what I value most. I just read the new Jim Crow, and this is such a fascinating statistic to me. And, you know, and if it's not your own story, then it could be a story that you have read or seen, but speak it from the heart. I know, an example of this, I've said that the Black Lives Matter movement's a terrorist organization. My mother-in-law is the one who said that to me. And so when I was in a conversation with her, I said, I hear that is what you have seen. That is not my experience. I have deep relationships and connections with folks who are a part of this movement. And I know that the facts are that Black people are being killed at the hands of police. And we have seen this happening, and this isn't new. We're just seeing it for the first time. And my experience and my friendship with Amy, who leads the Black Lives Matter movement, is that she's a mom and she's a friend and she cares about her community. And I have been to her home and had a meal with her. So I really, that's not my experience that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization. I don't even know if you have to repeat that, but that's not my experience. So the more we can tap into those ways of communicating, that even if we don't move the person, because that's part of the courage of this, is we might not move the needle, but we have spoken our truth and perhaps opened a little bit of space for that person to hear the next time they hear on the news a statistic or see a story, they also have our story side by side in their imagination. So, you know, the hope is that long term that these start to have an impact. But every time we engage in one of those conversations, we are, you know, creating a little bit of crack in this deep system, and as I said, the air we breathe that is so locked in ways of racism. So the other, before we move to Q&A, I'm going to do that in like 2 minutes, Deb, that I want to move us back. So let's say we've had that conversation with our neighbor or a friend or someone that we work with or someone in our family. Then we can come back and do the internal work again and reflect and think about, okay, how did I feel when I was having that conversation? Did I feel scared? Did I feel courageous and empowered? Did I feel like maybe I was being a little condescending? Did I feel like I listened and heard their story in a new way? So reflecting on our own experience and the way that we moved into that conversation, also reflecting a bit on the outcome. Did that person go straight to defensiveness and anger? If so, what could I do differently to be able to help keep them out of that part of the brain that moves into this, you know, their own fight or flight reflex? How can I better work this space? So that is how we get better and better at having these conversations. What did I say that I'd probably say differently next time? We all probably do that. I know I do it every single time I have a conversation. I walk away going, oh, I forgot to say this, or I should have said that. But that's what helps us learn and grow in this. So that is the bulk of my presentation. If you want to stop the recording, thank you all so much who are watching the recording. And I'll say before you stop the recording that if anybody would like to reach out to me personally, my email is amanda@interfaithallianceco.org, and I'm happy to answer any questions or talk to you further. All right.